Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're joined by Dr Brian Richardson, who earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 2001, where he then joined the faculty in communication studies at the University of North Texas. He specialised his research on the subject of organisational whistleblowing, crisis disaster communication and sports communication, and is now a professor in the same department. His research has been published in prominent journals and examines whistleblowers in the collegiate sport industry and within educational contexts, as well as exploring how whistleblowing impacts families, which is why we thought it'd be really interesting to have him along. He's also led study abroad programmes in Peru, Nicaragua and Panama, and most recently he's won awards for excellence in graduate teaching, amongst other things. He's also conducted communication training for a variety of organisations, so we're really pleased that we managed to get you on today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to talking to you.
Hi, Brian. Very good to meet you. Thanks for coming along today. Brian, there's been a lot of media attention to whistleblowers and the kind of recrimination that they face. How did you develop your interest in this subject, and how did you begin studying it?
Yeah, it goes back to my time as a doctorate student at the University of Texas. I, like many graduate students, had ideas about what I wanted to research when I was there. And while I was at the university, in the United States, college sports is a very big industry. A lot of money's at stake. A lot of state pride is at stake. It's almost as intense as European soccer, in many ways. And while I was there, an interesting thing happened. A little news story happened that one of the college basketball players sort of blew the whistle on his coach for abusive behavior. And what fascinated me as a organizational communication scholar and researcher was the response of various stakeholders. Here was someone who was trying to expose unethical behavior, and I was, I guess at that point, naive and thought he would be celebrated or at least recognized for bringing this concerns to everybody's attention. But the opposite happened, and what often happens in whistleblowing cases was he was roundly attacked, slandered. He happened to be from an affluent part of the state, and so people mocked him for being a rich, spoiled child. So bringing his financial situation into the discussion. And it just all seemed very odd to me, and an interesting phenomenon. And so why would we tell our children to teach, to talk the truth, to speak the truth, to raise concerns, but then punish them so vigorously when they do that as adults? And so just thinking about that conundrum, kind of spurred my interest into wanting to know more about this topic. So that's kind of a little story. And then I did my dissertation on organizational responses to wrongdoing, unethical behavior. And that kind of launched my research practice into this topic. So it all began with that one basketball player and his report.
Well, it's fascinating, and a good thing that it piqued your interest at the time, really. So how did your research go on and develop?
Well, I took that experience from graduate school, and one of the first research projects I really got into the weeds on this was looking at whistleblowers within that context of collegiate athletics. Again, it's an American phenomenon, the intense interest we have in college sports. And unlike other organizations, college sports has fans, people who are like consumers or customers would be to a traditional organization, but they are much more vociferous, much more passionate about their fandom. And so I wanted to know how whistleblowing dynamics changed in that context. And so my initial forays into whistleblowing was really focused on whistleblowers in college sports. And we looked at, my research partner and I, Joseph McGlynn, who I still research with, how industry and these macro level structures can impact micro dynamics. So we know that college sports is a very competitive environment. It's male dominated, particularly 15 years ago when we did this research. And so we looked at how, and we wondered how those cultural dynamics would impact individual cases. And we did see that that the competitive nature of college sports really motivated these outside influences to try to impinge on the case. So angry fans using message boards, using the media to attack the whistleblower. It's a very masculine environment, so a lot of the retaliation was sexual in nature, meaning that the connotation was this person's having an affair with the coach and they're trying to get revenge. The whistleblower, there was homosexual slurs used against the whistleblowers, so trying to almost emasculate. So we wanted to understand those dynamics, and they bore true. They came out kind of as we would expect, and we saw that how the industry could then impact whistleblowing processes. I've then gone on to look at other environments like public education, which is a very intense environment as well, because there you're dealing with children. And when you are impacting children or are perceived to be impacting children, you can also have severe retaliation. And so there's a big emphasis in those contexts on protecting the reputation, obviously, of most organizations. That would be true, to show that we are an honorable organization. And so, again, we see this passionate stakeholder group, educators or administrators, really pushing hard against anybody attempting to report wrongdoing in their schools. And so, quite a bit of my research has looked at how these macro level forces then influence whistleblowing processes. And it tends to bear out that things that are talked about at the higher levels, like at the administrative level, even the state level, and the way we talk about education, can then impinge on people attempting to reform these efforts, reform schools and universities.
That's fascinating, Ryan. I mean, this is perhaps a bit of an aside, but I can remember watching a couple of Buster Keaton movies many years ago where this kind of college sport featured. So the competitiveness has been around for many, many years.
Yeah.
Where does it come from?
Well, the United States is very good at commodifying anything. So I teach a communication and sport class, and we talk about how we commodify things. We take something that might have been meant for just pure pleasure, and we monetize it. We figure out a way to make money from it. And so that happened in college sports, historically speaking. Historically speaking, in the United States, we have taken college sports and said, the powers that be have noticed that we can make money from this through television revenue, primarily through attendance at sporting events. And so where you might see in other countries, sport is almost an aside. It may be an extracurricular activity that students participate in, but it never would impinge upon the academic mission of a university in other countries. Whereas in the United States, because it has been commodified and there are billion-dollar contracts for television to program sports, there's a lot of money at stake. And when there's money at stake, obviously, someone who attempts to reform or speak out against unethical behavior is going to be treated in a very negative manner, which, typical of whistleblower retaliation we would see. So I think that's kind of the link to it, is as the more we've commodified college sports in this case, the more power has been accumulated to it or given to it. So if you're an individual trying to speak out against to try to reform that power or correct some behavior, you're probably going to get quite a bit of pushback. So that's, kind of the history of how that I think that manifests.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. So I guess from what you've been saying that most of the whistleblowers you encountered weren't particularly troublemakers. They were victims rather than troublemakers. Is that right?
Yeah. Many of the whistleblowers I've interviewed through the course of my research, I would describe many of them as idealists more than troublemakers. They are, not all, but many are people who see things more in black and white tones and less than gray tones, meaning they might see something that looks suspicious or concerning behavior. I think a lot of people then try to rationalize it and say, oh, I'm going to ignore that because it doesn't hurt me personally, or if I get involved, it's just going to create more work for myself. I think whistleblowers, at least many of the ones I've interviewed, they don't have that blur. They don't dim it like that. They see it as, if it's wrong, we need to recognize it and call it out. If it's right, we can let that continue, obviously. So they tend to be idealists, and many of them also have in their story, their life narrative, something that happened that kind of changed the way they saw things. I'll give one example would be, I interviewed a whistleblower who in his childhood, I believe his father was found to be engaged in some sort of unethical behavior at his workplace. And it really affected, as it would most children, affected the way he saw his family dynamic, his father, but also the way he saw that sort of behavior. And it transformed in him a mindset that we need to call out all wrongdoing because it harms people, it harms families. And I saw that trend in many of the whistleblowers I've talked to, that something happened in their childhood that caused them to really to not rationalize wrongdoing, not to allow it to persist in any way. We need to stop it. And a lot of it's rooted in some sort of childhood experience they had. So I thought that was interesting. They're not troublemakers. They're firm believers in that we should always strive to do the right thing. Has been my experience.
Perhaps you could just ask, just really for the sake of listeners as well, really, just we're talking about whistleblowers, and for a lot of Joe public, they will think that means perhaps going to the press. But actually, most people who speak up about wrongdoing, whether it be work, sport, wherever, they're not going to the press. They're raising it in-house, aren't they? Was that true of the population you studied?
Yeah, overwhelmingly, whistleblowers attempt to fix things locally. They report it to a supervisor, a manager. They may talk it over with their coworkers, but they want it fixed, right? They don't want to bring attention to the organization in most cases. They want the problem fixed, and they'll go through a series of progression. They go to maybe their immediate supervisor. If they don't get good results, they take it up higher and higher. And then when they get no results and they're defeated within the organization, they might look to go external. But even then, they often will go to maybe an attorney or maybe a regulator. They don't typically seek out the media first. And in some cases, the media happens to learn about the story before they have before they have exposed it themselves. I think it's pretty rare that the whistleblower goes to the news media first. That's more of a rare occurrence in my experience. They just try to solve it and want to get on with their lives in that same organization. So they start local and typically don't get the results they expect.
Sounds like they go through a process of disillusionment.
Yeah, I think that's a great word to describe. And I listened to some of your podcasts that you've done before, and I heard the term moral injury. And I think that is a good description of what happens to whistleblowers as well, is that, they've come to believe that adults and managers and employees will do the right thing in organizations and will tell the truth and will treat people with respect and dignity, and business can be done in a proper way. And they are disillusioned, a great word, as they learn that in some cases that's not true, that people can be very cruel in professional context, and it's a form of moral injury when they have believed that business can be done ethically and people will treat each other with dignity and respect, and then they see the opposite, and it affects them to their soul. Like, how could this be? I thought we were decent people. And so I like that word disillusionment is very true for many of the whistleblowers I've interviewed.
Thank you, Brian. So you've mentioned families already, and of course some recent research that you've done examines the impact of whistleblowing on the families. Can you tell us a bit about that research?
Yeah, that's over the course of reading whistleblower case studies and other research by other scholars and my own research, every once in a while they would mention, I talked to my spouse and they didn't want to hear about it, or my children supported me, but I wanted them to live a normal life, so I didn't talk. So they would kind of mention it here and there, and then, obviously we know that whistleblowers are sometimes lose their jobs and they're blacklisted, and so I just began to wonder, how does this impact their family members? There hasn't been any research that I could note that really looked into that, and that initiated this most recent project. And I didn't want to just get the story from the whistleblower. I also wanted to talk to the actual family members themselves. And so through a process of reaching out and identifying whistleblowers, and there's different ways that I do that, I would interview them often about how it affected their families. And then I would ask, can I interview a family member? And I ultimately interviewed, I think it was 16, 17 whistleblowers about their family dynamic, and then about the same number of family members. So I wanted to get that 360 degree perspective. I think that's the word I'm looking for. And so the impacts were, in many cases, quite traumatic, as we might expect. And there's this term called work-life spillover, where things that happen to us at work spill over into our personal lives, or things that happen at home can spill over into our work lives. And so for me, it would be work-life spillover. So I'm having this horrible experience at work. I'm trying to expose some unethical behavior, and I'm being retaliated against. And then I bring that home as a whistleblower, and it's spilling over into my family life. And I basically noticed, kind of looking at this group of people, these three different patterns that emerged. And I called them I focused it on family identity. All families have identities. You may have a sports family or an education family, a close-knit family. There's just different ways we might characterize our families. And for me, in looking at the whistleblowers, I noticed sort of three patterns. And I'll just quickly go through those. So one was what I call the affirmed families. So they managed to navigate the whistleblowing experience in ways that kind of affirmed who they were. And I'll give you an example. I interviewed one family that I interviewed the whistleblower's wife, and she said, we've always been social justice warriors. We always are calling out concerns. We are cognizant that people are abused, and we want to always address that. And so for them, the whistleblowing experience, which became quite nasty, was something that they were able to absorb fairly easily. I shouldn't say easily. They absorbed it and managed that process because that was who their family was. So they affirmed their identity. Then we have what I call the fragmented families. And those were the ones that the whistleblowing actually kind of broke them in some way. For example, there was one couple that became divorced, and the whistleblower interviewed said she believed it was largely because she was trying to correct a wrongdoing at work. In this case, it was uh, a school for children with learning disabilities, and she noticed they were being abused, which would be a problem for most people. And she began to report that and really speak out against it. And her spouse was not accommodating to that and felt that she was unnecessarily bringing attention to the family and to the problem. And it caused a lot of tension between them and a lot of stress. And ultimately, their marriage didn't survive. And so I saw that was my second identity, was it fragmented the family in some fundamental way. The other was being estranged from adult children. The whistleblowing experience was so toxic for the family as the children were young, that now that as older adults, they had kind of distanced from their parents. And the whistleblower that I interviewed she cried during the interview as she talked about this sort of estrangement. And she said it was, largely blamed it on the whistleblowing retaliation she received made things unpleasant. And the kids did not want to be reminded of that as they got older. And then the last group that I looked at or would recognize was what I called the wounded families. And they were still trying to, in many ways, process the whistleblowing experience. So, whether it be job loss or, so what happens to a lot of whistleblowers is they either can't stop talking about the situation or they don't want to talk about it. They kind of bounce back and forth, at least in my research. And so in some cases, nonstop talking about it kind of wounded the family, caused conflict. Can we please stop talking about this? In other cases, there was not enough communication about it. And so the whistleblower internalized everything, which caused them a lot of stress, like literal physical discomfort over time. And that affected the way they talked within their family. And so when I interviewed those families, there was almost a sense of sadness as they talked about the case. Like my partner, their career was so promising, and then they did this, and their career was completely changed, and it's just like a sadness that hung over them. And so that's kind of how I captured the whistleblowing's effect on the families. In some cases, it didn't have this significant impact. It kind of affirmed who they were. In other cases, it actually kind of broke them up in some ways. And in some cases, they stayed together, but it was like a sense of constant or maybe, submerged sorrow or sadness or grief over this case that cast a pall over their family experience. So it had a significant impact on many of the families that I interviewed in those ways.
Thank you. And of course, you're a communications expert, aren't you? So do you think seeing the families through that particular lens helped you in this research?
Yeah. So, the question I ask in the research is, how did these different family identities come to be? And as a communication scholar, you're right, I'm kind of looking at what communication dynamics could play a role. So, for example, the oversharing or undersharing, that was significant for many of these cases. So whistleblowers, going back to the moral injury and trying to make sense of what's happening, they sometimes will just talk. That's almost all they want to talk about. And it makes sense, right? Their complete view of the world has been turned upside down, right? And so they're trying to make sense of it. And they want an audience that'll listen to them and say, I understand you, I want to help you. And it's so hard for them to find that audience. So they talk about it a lot. So I basically make a case in the paper that over talking about it is problematic. The family needs to have other experiences, right? Under talking about it, so not talking about it at all, is problematic because the whistleblower they're absorbing all the stress themselves. They become damaged, and then they can't function as well as they would in their families. So I basically argue in the paper that and the families that were more successful at handling this, they constantly negotiated how much they were going to talk about it. There's a lot of conversations about how they would talk about it. So, are you ready to talk about it today? So they might ask a question like, are you ready to talk about this today? Let's go for a walk and tell me about it. And then when the walk's over, we'll talk about other things. So I guess you'd call it like talk about the talk, right? Let's make sure that we're negotiating how much conversation we're going to have about this rather than making it all whistleblowing or no whistleblowing. And another thing I noticed was what I call it's called communal coping. It's so social support is important, also like supporting the whistleblower. Communal coping is a branch of that, but in communal coping, it's like the whistleblowing. An example would be the whistleblowing is not your problem; it's our problem as a family, and we need to recognize it as it's our issue. Maybe is a better way to say it, or our challenge. It's ours together, and we're gonna approach it together. So communal coping's been used to study like how people stop smoking. Example would be rather than saying to the smoker, you go figure out a way to stop smoking, it's more like as a family, smoking is harming us. So we're going to all approach this together. And so that's the same with whistleblowers. Rather than saying to the whistleblower or maybe implying it's your problem, we'll support you, but it's mainly your thing. Communal coping is the whistleblowing is all of our problem as a family, or all of our challenge, or all of our issue, and we're going to attack it as a team, or approach it as a team, or as a unit. And I think that mindset helped families who were able to navigate the whistleblowing experience more successfully by kind of taking a team approach to it. We're all in this together sort of approach. So I think those two things can make a difference: communal coping, but also navigating and negotiating how much we're going to talk about this issue.
That's really interesting. And, just that whole idea of thinking about them as a part in a system rather than thinking about them as individuals. And so interesting to see that added something in terms of how that could add and strengthen the ability to cope, but also how important establishing the kind of like boundaries around communication was. Is there anything else you think that came out of your research as a consequence of thinking about them within that system of the family rather than thinking about them as an individual?
Yeah, I think another thing that came out is how important it is to, even as a family unit, to maintain connections to the outside groups, outside systems. Because as you know, I actually listened to one of your interviews, podcast interviews with a whistleblower that you interviewed in the I think it was long-term care for elderly people, and she talked about isolation. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So another pattern that we see in whistleblowers is they become isolated, and that's through job termination, people not wanting to associate with them because they're stigmatized, things like that. So that becomes true for some families as well. They became isolated. Like people that were in their network of friends and social support wanted kind of cut off ties with them in some ways. And so I think it's very important to find other connections if maybe there are people who disassociate, but seeking out other social networks beyond the family is also important, to remind them that to help them make sense of what's happening, to identify other opportunities for support from external groups, to help them understand that what they're doing, what they're going through is not their fault. And so I think that isolation as a retaliation tactic or a retaliation outcome is one of the most profound impacts that is put upon the whistleblower, but also their families. And so anything they can do to maintain or create new contexts beyond the family that give them a semblance of normalcy and understanding and social support is critical. And I would recommend that. That's another pattern that I saw in my own research.
That's really interesting to hear that. And we kind of like, there's quite a lot of discussion about individual whistleblowers becoming isolated, but I hadn't thought about that from a family perspective. And it also makes me wonder whether whistleblowers in certain industries might be more susceptible to that. So you can see how that might work in sport, but also perhaps industries where there's a big emphasis on socialising as a community, you know, for instance, like mining community, or something where there's, or the military, where there's an emphasis on the camaraderie between families, not just individuals. That might not have shown up in your research, though.
Yeah, that's very true. There's a famous case study. I can't remember the name. It was made into a movie about a whistleblower who was sexually harassed and assaulted in a mining community, and her blowing the whistle brought undue attention to the company, and she was perceived as a threat to the company staying in the town. And so there are some communities that are so reliant upon a particular industry or organization that even though outside or other families may recognize that there's some unethical behavior, they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want their families to lose their source of income. And so, you know, for better or for worse, they see the whistleblower as a threat to their livelihoods. And that's a different phenomenon that we might see in other whistleblowing cases. And I would probably guess it's even more isolating because you're seen as a threat to everybody's livelihood. And if you're seen supporting that whistleblower, people are afraid they're going to be then stigmatized. Mm-hmm. So I can definitely see that being the case in many industries.
Yeah, it's quite shocking. But, right, Brian, so we've spoken about your background being in communication, and I think one of the things that you were quite interested in was the use of metaphor that whistleblowers use to explain their narrative. I wondered if you could say a little about that.
Yeah, so in communication studies in my field, metaphors are often highlighted as a key part of research, and we know that metaphors are used to help someone explain to someone else an experience that their listener may not be accustomed to. So we might use a metaphor to describe a harrowing experience so other people can understand what we went through. And when I interviewed these whistleblowers recently, they used a lot of metaphors to describe. They would just naturally go into metaphors. And so my recent research, or most up-to-date project, is taking those metaphors and examining what they mean. And I've got the research here on my computer. I'm kind of looking at it because I'm not as don't have it quite memorized. But we noticed metaphors of physical harm. And if you'll indulge me, I'll read a couple of them. But
yeah, please do.
And listen to how harrowing these are. So one whistleblower said her experience was like being burned on the stake over and over and over again. Another whistleblower said her experience was the same as a victim and survivor of, say, child abuse. Another one said the harassment was like torture. It was a rape. It was like a rape. When they attack your dignity, it's like a rape. And I don't understand how nobody cares. So comparing the retaliation, I've never been a whistleblower and I've never experienced that retaliation. But to hear someone else compare it to child abuse and rape and torture indicates to me how profound that experience is. Another one, I saw myself as Anne in the group of King Kong. The angry giant does what he wants. There is no power to stop him. Everyone is afraid. I can scream all I want. I am alone in a battle against the giant. So we look at a metaphor like that and say, what does that mean, right? It's powerlessness. It's being a victim of someone who has control of your life and can hold you in the palm of their hand. And that also it indicates nobody is going to help me. They're afraid of the giant as well. And so we're beginning to kind of work through these and show like how they indicate physical harm, mental harm, isolation, which we talked about, and some of the things that are just really to help your listeners see the impact on these whistleblowers. things like, I'll give you another one. It was the most stressful time of my life. It was 4.5 years of not being able to sleep, knots in your stomach, health problems directly related to stress. 4 years of knots in your stomach, not being able to sleep, hurting from the inside was another one. So you just see like the metaphors do a great job of connoting just how traumatic this experience is. There was comparisons to PTSD. One of my whistleblowers had served in the military and had gone through combat. And he said it's very similar. The whistleblowing experience was similar to decompressing after combat. I mean, those are such powerful allegories or stories of help people relate to, yeah, this is a very traumatic experience. And the other piece to a lot of these is I want an audience to listen to me. And people, they can't find a receptive audience. And so I think that increases their moral injury as well.
Absolutely. I've worked with a lot of whistleblowers who I would say do qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've also worked with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And I guess what's common to both is that kind of lack of someone to listen to and validate their story of the wrongdoing. I was struck by the use of, the idea of being defiled that's there in, the really powerful metaphors. But I think, the research on whistleblowers is quite often they've been exemplary employees, often, performed at an exceeded level. So they're people who've prided themselves on their reputation and doing things with integrity, and then often depicted in a way that's, assassinates their character. So you can understand why people have that sense of being defiled by the process, really. But I think those anecdotes that you pull out from the material of your research, very, very powerful in terms of conveying how bad it can be for people. I think there was some research that found that actually the process of recrimination has such a bad impact on people's physical health that it's actually worse than cancer in terms of the impact, not just psychologically, but also in terms of their overall levels of health after going through this kind of process.
Yeah.
Horrible. I think it's great that you're able to bring out the detail of these, as you say, very harrowing situations. Mm-hmm. But I can't help thinking that the shorthand for what you're describing is bullying. Whistleblowing brings forth bullying.
Yeah. Yes. As I was thinking about why does this happen? Why or how does it happen? And I was able to interview one whistleblower who gave me a great analogy that kind of makes me think of bullying as well. And he was severely retaliated against. He was a military contractor. He was in a military contractor position, and I don't want to go into too many details to protect his identity, but he blew the whistle against what he saw as systemic abuses of soldiers. I'll put it that way. And then he encountered the retaliation we've been talking about, but he began to research his experience. And he stumbled upon this concept I think is really fascinating and kind of relates to bullying. So it's called Zersetzung. All right, it's an East German term or German term, and he found that the East German secret police, when they wanted to confront an enemy of the state, they wouldn't visibly attack them or visibly strike out against them because they wanted to maintain an air of legitimacy. So what they would do instead was this Zersetzung process, which is a no-touch form of torture. So we're going to torture you without touching you. And specifically, they would do things to isolate the person systematically. They would fall reports about their jobs that were false, but that would cause the person to lose their job. They would start rumors in the community that would cause people to want to distance from this individual. And over time, the individual is noticing that everything that anchors them to the world, their job, their family, the social clubs they might belong to, are being severed. And they're not sure why in this case. They may suspect it, but they're not exactly sure because it's done in a very secretive way. But the idea is that by cutting all these anchors to these things that give us our identity, you can drive the person mad. You can cause them to just sort of, completely isolate themselves and sort of crumble under that pressure. And he compared that to the experience he had gone through. And there is some comparison there that rings true in that now not all whistleblowers go through these sorts of levels, but I've certainly talked to some that's like they lose their job. So they lose that connection. Their family and friends. We talked about how in a community, people may disassociate with them because they're stigmatized. So they lose that connection. Their family, they may have family members who say, why did you do this to our family? They may lose those. And so you can see how systematic it can be to where they're just gradually cut off from those things that give them support. And I haven't researched this. I'm just curious, like how systematic and intentional is this on the organization's end? Or do they mindfully retaliate, or is it sort of happenstance retaliation that ends up in these outcomes? I'm not sure, and that's something I haven't investigated, but it does make me wonder, is there conspiracy or collusion within the organization? Hey, let's go get this person, or does it happen more accidentally? I'm not sure, but there's certainly in some cases it feels very purposeful.
I love that that analogy actually, because I think that does fit for many people. I wondered if you could spell it actually, because I do want to.
Yes, I've got it right here. It starts with a Z. So ZERZETSUNG. And there's a little bit of literature. You can Google search it and you'll see information about it.
Thank you. But I guess there are times when it's not deliberate, but I also know of cases where it absolutely has been deliberate. So information has been intentionally taken out of context in order to depict people in ways that can't possibly be interpreted as innocent misinterpretation of information. So I think it's such a powerful phrase, I think, to describe some people's experiences. As you say, not everybody's, but probably enough to make it resonate with many people in amongst those who whistleblow.
Yeah.
How did the whistleblower? Did you look at how the whistleblowers coped as individuals with what's happening to them, or were you just concerned with how that happened as a group?
I typically will ask questions about how they coped it, or as individuals, and I'll and telling their stories, they may talk about it as well. It's a variety of things that I've seen. Some things that come to mind. Some people rely on their religious faith, their religious beliefs. I can recall an interview, whistleblower I interviewed who spoke very matter of fact about as a Christian, I'm called to do the right thing, and I'll, that's just what I do, and kind of leaning into religious beliefs to support or to manage the stress that they were going through. Others coped by physical activity. Actually, was quite pronounced by several whistleblowers. Going for, I can remember two in particular, going for long walks with their spouse every day and just decompressing and talking about what they were going through. I think I mentioned this one earlier. And then when we get back to the house, it's back to normalcy. And another one who took up long distance running and long distance swimming. And I bring those up to say that just gives me further indication of just the amount of stress piled upon their shoulders, that you're needing, that going for marathon long runs or marathon long swims, for a lot of people to be like, I'd have no interest in that. That's too much. But to relieve yourself of the stress, that physical activity helped them unburden, I guess you'd say. Others that I've interviewed relied on social support, talking with others. And I should mention, there are now, I feel like more than ever, support groups for whistleblowers. I know in the United States we have Whistleblowers of America. I believe there's one called the Lamplighter. Maybe it's just called the Lamplighter. That's for police officers who have blown the whistle. So there's now groups that people can reach out to that have experience working with whistleblowers and can help them understand that they're not alone and can give advice. And several of my whistleblowers I've interviewed recently said that these groups have been very helpful to help them understand. First of all, they help them show there's resources available to them, but just kind of making sense of the devastating experience through these support groups has been very helpful. And then that's kind of the sad part. So that's ways I've seen of coping. But the sad part is I've talked to some who are still kind of in a state, even years after, of struggle still, are still seemingly processing this, or have kind of lead now a very reserved life, kind of some kind of alone in some ways. And it's kind of a sad reminder that not everybody fully gets through this unscathed. So there's definitely some coping strategy I noticed, and I mentioned those, but then, like I said, there's some that there was still a sadness in their voice when I interviewed them that they have still not fully, and maybe maybe in many cases they never do, but I could still sense the sadness in the way they talked and what they said, that they were still struggling to kind of make sense of everything that had happened, even if it was years ago. So, but
we will share links in our show notes, and we usually put the transcript on Substack. So we'll share links to those organisations you've mentioned, and also some organisations in the UK like Justice for Whistleblowers, Justice for Doctors, this Facebook group. So any of those kind of resources that we can find, we'll share, because I know that having those conversations helps ameliorate the isolation that I think people experience. So I suppose one of the things I think people can struggle with is how to make sense of their identity as, as an individual. Once people have spoken up, it seems often that people get so sucked into their story that they almost calcify whistleblower into their identity, which then can make it hard, I think, for people to move on and to create a future that isn't about how they've been wronged.
Yeah, that's something I asked in my interview. I asked that question to many of my interviewees. I said, do you see yourself now as a whistleblowing family? Did that identity become kind of who you were? And there was some mixed reaction there. Some said, yeah, that's kind of who we are. But that was a minority. I think most of them said it's a part of our, if you think of our life as like a book, it's one chapter in the book. We may go back to that chapter sometimes, but we've moved past it. But like I said, there was a few cases where that identity, even the whistleblower identity for the family, kind of affected them. I shouldn't say affected them, but kind of like exhibited who they were much of the time. And I think you've seen in your interviews with whistleblowers that they've continued on, and they're now working to keep reforming things. And I think that identity, that's an identity thing, right? And I've seen that as well, where there's some whistleblowers who they had this experience and it becomes a part of their identity, and now they're wanting to correct wrongdoings and correct injustice for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But I've interviewed some who, like I said earlier, it's like, this happened, it was a part of my story, but it's not who I am. Yeah. I've gone on with my life. And so I think my sense is either way, they're finding purpose. For some, it's like finding justice is the way I'm going to spend my life, and it's a wonderful way to do it. And for others, it's like, no, I'm going to do other things. So they kind of take different approaches.
Do you think there are some who just regret speaking up in the first place, Brian?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting. The research I've seen research that where whistleblowers have said, I wish I'd never done this. And then some that said, I would do it all over again the same way. In my most recent study, most of them said, I had to do it. I could not walk away from this. I could not ignore it. But I did interview one that stood out to me. And he said, I wish I hadn't done it. It fundamentally changed his family dynamic. He mentioned in the interview that before the whistleblowing, and he was married to someone who was very powerful in their country, had a very respected high position. And he also had a respected position. And he blew the whistle in a situation he was in. And he was one of the ones that kept it to himself. He really tried to separate it from his family life. And it almost killed him. He talked about he came this close to killing himself, committing suicide. But he didn't, and he persisted. And he said, this situation fundamentally changed my marriage. Whereas before we were equal partners, that has shifted the balance of power in our relationship. And now I am in a persistent low power balance in my family. And he said, I wish I'd never blown the whistle. And he said, I would advise other people to really consider not blowing the whistle as well, because it just is not worth the cost you incur. So the vast majority said they would do it again, but there are a few that I've interviewed that said, I wish I had not done it. And then one last thing I'll say on that is some of the family members I talked to said, I'm glad they blew the whistle, or it's okay, but I wish they had done it in a different way. Maybe written an anonymous letter or some way that protected them versus being public about it. And so I think there's a little bit of a mixed reaction there. But back to the thing we said early in the interview, a lot of whistleblowers are idealists, I think, at heart. And it's hard for them to walk away from injustice. And so they just can't. And I think that's the ones who said, no, I would do it again. I would do it again. It was just the right thing to do. But there is that percentage that says it's just not worth the cost.
Thank you. It remains a puzzle, though, doesn't it? You've mentioned the financial considerations which can lead to recriminations, the mining town you mentioned, and college sports. But that isn't always the case, isn't it? So I wonder why sometimes there seems to be so little support. Given that most people are fairly decent characters, why does there sometimes seem to be so little support for whistleblowers?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've, there's a lot of research into what's called bystander intervention. You may have heard that, where if I see someone being approached or something bad's going to happen to someone, do I intervene or not? And so, I think in my discussions or conversations with whistleblowers, they give the reasons we would expect a lot of times. That the whistleblower I just talked about, the one who's kind of the power dynamic shifted in his relationship, he said a lot of people in his organization felt the same way he did about the unethical behavior. They also saw the wrongdoing that was going on. But he said a lot of them were younger. They were recently had children. And for them, it wasn't they didn't want to risk their financial stability. So I think there's a cost benefit analysis for a lot of people. I don't want to risk financial security or my financial future. There's this concept called commitment, which when we publicly commit to a position, it's very hard for most people to go against that position once we've started. So if I hear someone in my company has blown the whistle and I begin to get defensive against them or begin to say, why would they do that? And I take a position that's pro company, it's hard for me to switch back, So I think a lot of people take a position before they know the situation. And once they take a position, it's hard for them to walk back from that. So I think there's fear factor there. People rationalize it as well. I think it's easy today to see how much corruption there is in organizations, to say it's going on everywhere. Why, that's just a part of our economy. Wrongdoing or unethical behavior, corruption is so woven into our system, we can't really fix it. It's too much for me to fix as an individual. I think that's a reason people ignore it or don't support whistleblowers. And I think it goes back to, too, even as children, when a child tattletales, even children may be reluctant to go befriend the tattletale. And I use that term, and it's pejorative, right? It's not, it's a term that's used on a playground, but I don't want to be associated with this person who did this, because I'll be bullied. And so I think it's some self-preservation going on there as well. I'm interested to watch the Boeing case. I don't know if you're following that.
Yes.
So there's been a small number of whistleblowers that's growing. And I'm hoping, as a citizen, that there's strength in numbers, and that remedies can be brought, and that organization can be turned around in a responsible way, because of the voice of so many versus one person trying to do it alone. And I think that's what I hope a lot of companies are. It's such a wonderful thing to see that kind of support given to one person, so they're not having to do it by themselves. And you get social support, you get a stronger argument, you get more evidence. And so hopefully that'll be a trend we see moving forward, that people can attract that support both within the organization and externally to move a case forward.
Yeah, definitely strength in numbers. Although I think, was it John Barnett, the guy who was found dead and under possibly suspicious circumstances? And again, you think, actually, if there's many of you, many are harder to take on than, whether he killed himself or whether something darker and more sinister happened. The more people that speak up, it offers some kind of protection, doesn't it? But I'm conscious of the time, Brian, and so probably brings us to our last question, really. But if we dig into stories of whistleblowers, they're often exposing a really dark side to institutions, bad or unethical practice, the risk of harm to service users, sometimes even atrocities. How have you maintained your own emotional well-being whilst researching this area?
Very similar to that whistleblower I mentioned earlier, who took the long walks with his spouse. So interviewing whistleblowers can be, it's a form of emotional labor, I guess. And I mean that in the best way possible, meaning I really have high admiration for these individuals. I always thank them for doing what's good for society, and let them know I appreciate not just their stories, but their willingness to help other people. But going for long walks with my wife and talking about what I had heard, it is hard I don't want to put myself in saying that anything I went through was what traumatic like they did, or I would say, and hearing them talk about suicide ideation, families crumbling, it is hard. And so going for long walks, talking about it with my spouse, having a colleague that I do research with and talking about it with him gives me that kind of social support. And then also I want to hope that there's a greater good coming of all this, that we are bringing attention to the whistleblower problem, and the problem being that we don't listen to them and they are harmed. And so by the more we can do platforms like this, get the word out, the more books are written, movies made, we can begin to recognize that society has treated these individuals very poorly, and we need to rally to their support. So knowing that I'm on the good side of the fight, so to speak, helps me as well. And so that's kind of my way of coping with it.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you about it genuinely, as I think it's they're painful stories to hear, and actually, I think people need that research to be done by people who are capable of recognising the pain and allowing it to resonate and holding on to that, because otherwise it becomes something that's neutralised and minimised when, we're talking about action that devastates people's lives. So it's great that you do that. So delighted to have you on. I believe that you're still looking for research participants, and we'll put your email address in the show notes, put a link to you. I think I connected with you over LinkedIn, and I'll put ways to contact you in the transcript so that people can reach out to you. And I know that people in the whistleblowing community often really do want to continue to fight for justice, so they're keen to have more research available. So thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you for your wonderful podcast. That's got a great purpose behind it.
Great to meet you, Brian, and thanks very much for your powerful conversation.
Thank you.